Ren, thank you for joining us again today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and of course. We're discussing The Lower Depths today by Maxim Gorky. One of the central themes is harsh truth versus the comforting lie, the illusion of hope versus the starkness of reality. Most of the characters choose to deceive themselves over the bleak reality of their condition. For myself, this is, I think, the fourth time I've actually read the play. But Ren, this is your first time reading Gorky's play. So what were your impressions generally?
Well, I first of all, I will say that I did really enjoy it. It was a really interesting prospect going into Gorky because for the most part, my experience with Russian literature is 19th century Russian literature. So obviously this is just turn of the century. I think it was published in 1902.
Yes,
But in any case, you could really still see already the difference, even just in the style in which he's presenting his writing, the coarseness of some of the language he was willing to use that I think a lot of 19th century writers were a bit reluctant to be that vulgar, I guess, was kind of interesting. And also, I think there was a lot of, unfortunately, I think in a sense, crossover thematically from a lot of, especially maybe what Dostoevsky was up to. I think that's probably your next question, so I don't want to step on your toes to jumping straight to that. But I think that was very interesting to me. And also, I think probably the most striking thing that stuck with me from reading the play is how relevant it is 100 years later now. Like it was very easy for me to see this being put on now and maybe changing out some of the roles of some of the characters, but I think that conceptually, unfortunately, this would still be very relevant.
absolutely. I definitely agree. And it's still being shown in many theaters, still very
Mhm.
popular, and I think it very much for that reason that it resonates.
Mhm.
And speaking more about the language, would you say that has to do with the class background of Gorky versus the class background of, say, Dostoevsky or Pushkin or Tolstoy?
I did somewhat wonder about that. If I don't know if we're kind of ready to dive into that side of it, but yeah, I was going to say that my background being very heavily Dostoevsky when it comes to Russian literature, I definitely got the impression that though Dostoevsky certainly was very sympathetic to the plight of poor people and was very invested in popping the hood on how people were conceptualizing poverty in Russia, I did get this sense that he was looking at it from the outside in. And I think that that was somewhat perhaps limiting in his capacity to represent the people that he was talking about. So I think that he ended up defaulting to an almost romanticized notion of what poor people were. Not to say that he didn't show some of the wretchedness of their living conditions, but I think if I think of especially his poor female characters that he has in like Poor Folk or in Notes from Underground, Crime and Punishment, a lot of these women maintain a level of dignity and virtue that I think is a little bit more romanticized than certainly what Gorky was engaging with. And that to me was already kind of an interesting divergence in their approach to that subject matter. And I agree with what I think you're saying, which is that their backgrounds probably played a huge role in that. And if I understand correctly, I think Gorky also, or at least I've read that he even visited some of these places that he was describing. Is that right? To get a sense of what people's lives actually were like and what the conditions were really like on the ground. I don't know that Dostoevsky ever did that.
It's interesting. So Gorky actually did have quite of a tragic and also humble background.
Mm.
He had a bit of an abusive background, um, and living that kind of lifestyle and being a bit of a vagabond. He meets all these
Mhm.
different kinds of people and probably family and extended family and family friends who fit these kinds of archetypes. Whereas with Dostoevsky, um, I think it's also kind of that situation, like you said, outside looking in, where he grew up at the Mariinsky Hospital and he was able to learn about all of these different people, different characters, but it wasn't something that was necessarily um, as close to his heart as it was to say Gorky, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, Dostoevsky lived a very odd and interesting life, to say the very least. And not to say that he didn't have struggles with poverty, but I think that because of the class system in Russia, certainly at the time, his experience of poverty was just never going to touch the type of experience of poverty that these characters in the lower depths were born into for the most part, and really had no chance of escaping from, which I think, and we'll probably get into this a little later in the discussion, but I think in terms of determinism, like if you weren't born with the right name, there was only so much that you could possibly do. And I think that that was somewhat a limitation of Dostoevsky's investigations into poverty, is that he never quite seemed to touch that very directly. It was sort of more like, oh, I feel very, very strongly that these people are treated unfairly, and I think that society treats them unfairly, but he didn't seem to know what the solution to that was.
right? The correct antidote.
Mm.
So as you mentioned, The Lower Depths was written in 1902 in the imperial period, and not too long before the Russian Revolution.
Mhm.
But with that being said, what do you think Gorky's hopes were with um, writing The Lower Depths, and what was his goal with presenting it during that period?
Ooh, big question. I mean, I think that is kind of, at least from somebody who's sort of tackling this from the perspective of having read the play, but not necessarily having the same depth of knowledge of his biography that you do. I think maybe our answers will be a little different, but my impression from having read the text was, of course, there's this central question of stark reality, comforting truth. But what I found kind of more interesting was the third door that he sort of implies is there, which is compassion. And especially with the character of Luca, who has several conversations where he talks about the importance of kindness. And he tells the story about the two would-be thieves who he takes in, and they all watch over his wherever his house or whatever his property at the time. And to me, that sort of seems like it's ultimately the answer to what is the point of this play, which is that maybe it's not necessarily up to these people, like maybe their choice between those two things is sort of irrelevant when hope and escapism are these very internal processes. And he makes it very clear, I think, that regardless of whether they choose to live in real, in reality, or they choose escapism, I mean, functionally their lives are not going to be that different. It would actually take this kind of external force from society that has the opportunity to change that to actually have a more compassionate system. And to me, that was sort of my takeaway from this, which was like, there isn't really much that poor people in that situation can do. Like, it doesn't
As
ultimately
individuals?
matter. Yeah, exactly. Like, as individuals, there's not much that they can do. Like, there is no real material difference for them whether they choose or whether, yeah, hope and escapism, or whether they choose to live in reality. I mean, the one character who had a job at the beginning of the play, by the end of the play, even though he did everything he was supposed to, he was working. As soon as his wife dies, he had to sell his tools. So, and what was he to do? Like, there was no way that him living in reality actually materially made his life better than, say, Natasha.
What is to be
That
done,
was what I felt.
as it said, what is to be done?
Yeah. I mean, if ever there was sort of a thesis, I think, and it's interesting going back to Dostoevsky ever so briefly, because when he wrote The House of the Dead, I think that's the closest that he ever got to that being the central question, and possibly also the solution. Because at the end of The House of the Dead, he's talking, of course, about prison, but certainly I think ex-cons fit very well into the cast of characters that we have in the lower depths, right? And he talks about what a waste of life it is to put all of these healthy young men in prison in Siberia, and they're just rotting there doing nothing useful for themselves or for society. And in a sense, I think that that is where the overlap with Gorky is, because that seems also to be what he's saying. It's like, what is even the point of this? Like, why do we have this system that exists that wastes the lives of so many people who otherwise might be useful, or have some sort of meaningful existence? So I think that's probably the closest to that overlap that I see them having.
So you would say that he's promoting the idea of a collective?
Certainly, I think so. I mean, even just by implication, right? Because of course, that's not the central focus of the action of the play, nor is it really even directly what we get in the conclusion. But I think that by having Luca mention that story about how he was in a position to actually show compassion to these two people who frankly meant him harm because he was able to understand where that desperation was coming from, he actually uplifted all three of them because it was helpful to him to have them there to help him watch over this property. Certainly, it gave them a roof over their heads. And I think the implication of what happens to those two thieves afterwards is a little ambiguous. Like I don't remember if he directly says, and then they lived lives that were, not criminal, or I don't remember if they just wander off again. But I found that section of the play, that story that he told, really, really stuck with me in terms of how in such stark contrast that it stood, I think, to everything else that was going on, and even his suggestions of leaning into escapism. I felt like that idea of compassion sort of existed outside of that dichotomy of reality versus the comfortable lie, and that was where I was like, oh, I wonder if that's sort of an implication that maybe that's the answer. It's not really these other two things. I don't know how it struck you. You've read it obviously many times, and you certainly seem like you have a very good grounding in the historical context in which he was writing this. So I don't know if I'm like completely off the mark, but
No, I think you're definitely after it. Promoting that compassion, and I think speaking more ideologically more about class solidarity and class
hmm
consciousness and class interest. And all these
hmm
people have these different backgrounds and different ideas and views about
hmm
life. But what unites them is that they're being oppressed essentially
hmm
by the system. And by showing solidarity and creating like I said, this collective,
hmm
um, they can rise from the lower depths, possibly.
yeah. And I
Um,
actually wonder what your feelings are about that idea, because to me, that's also part of what the relevance to our times now is of the message of this play. Because to me, this faults, I think it's sort of like a distraction of this question of like, oh, should we live in this world of escapism and fantasy, or should we just face the reality? To me, that's kind of a distraction that pits people against each other who otherwise would be able to form that sense of class consciousness and solidarity. Because, in a way, that to me sort of was the grounds for a lot of the clashes between the characters in the play. I mean, again, you have Kleich, who is like saying, oh, you guys are all absolutely ridiculous. Like, I'm a working man. I actually go out and earn my living. And what do you do? And you're just languishing in these fantasies of, oh, maybe I'll, I don't know, run off with some man. Like I think Natasha was reading her romance novels or whatever. And to me, that does sort of, I think that's almost on purpose in a way, that that's presented as you have to pick one of these paths, when it's like, no, it doesn't really matter which one of those paths you choose, because ultimately the only thing that's going to uplift any of you is if you work together. So to me, that's the real illusion, is that there's a dichotomy there.
yeah, definitely. And I'm just reminded what you said, that it's super relevant today, and how
Mm-hmm.
much social media is being consumed, how much television and
Yeah.
TV shows are being produced, and in my opinion, a subpar quality, but are being overproduced for the
Mm-hmm.
exact goal of distraction.
Yeah. And I think though that again it's kind of interesting, because I think there's a lot of discussion at the lower levels, the lower depths, of whether or not it's a waste of your time to use, for example, the, like, let's say the golden age of television as a form of escapism. It's like, no, you should be on your grind set, you should be working all
Yeah,
the time. And it just seems like the people who are having that argument about whether or not it's a waste of time or life to engage in that type of escapism, I'm like, we're all kind of on the same level here. Like
yeah,
the people who actually have power are not having this conversation, but I bet you that they're very happy that the peons down below are having this argument, because if you're too busy arguing over whether or not, you're a better more productive person because you never watched Game of Thrones and you were, I don't know, investing in cryptocurrency or something. Like,
Mhm.
I feel like that kind of gets in the way of that development of class consciousness as well. And to me, that is sort of the cyclical part of this play where I'm like, wow, you can really see this argument playing out again now between the people who frankly should be like, wait, why are we choosing to argue about this? Like whether or not you watched Game of Thrones and I invested in cryptocurrency, at the end of the day, we're both sort of like cogs in the same machine, you know. That was
Yeah.
just my feeling about it.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting kind of worms with all that because everyone's saying escape the matrix
Mm-hmm.
or whatever, and then their antidote is the matrix, getting
Yeah.
on the grind set and working um, all day and only sleeping 5 hours. They're just redirecting it back into the system, which is very
Yeah.
interesting. So
Oh,
it's
totally. Because I think those are the two categories of people that we see in the lower depths as well. And ultimately, to me, the most poignant aspect of this is, and where do they all end up? In exactly the same place
yes,
or
it kind of
dead.
reminds me of this quote from Act Three from
Hmm.
Satine. And I love Satine. All of her lines,
Hmm.
I absolutely. Um, she says, "Why people aren't ashamed to let you live worse than a dog? Just think, you stop work, so do I, so do hundreds, thousands of others. Everybody, understand? Everybody will quit working. Nobody will do a damn thing, and then what will happen?"
Mm. Yeah, I think that really encapsulates that idea very well. Yeah, Satine is a very interesting character in this because I know one of the critiques of this play is that there are kind of too many characters. Um, I think if you ever really want to understand what the folk feel about a piece of art, you just all you have to go do is take a look at the Goodreads comments. And that was definitely one of the critiques of this is that there are too many people. But I think that I mean, you could have a discussion about that, but I think that regardless, Satine and Luca are two characters that really rise to the top and are very distinctive. And I don't even really think they're at odds with each other. I know there are some analyses that kind of pit them against each other a little bit, but I would disagree with that. I think I would disagree with that. But yeah, Satine definitely got some of the best lines in the whole play for sure.
No doubt. But speaking more about Gorky,
Hmm.
um, I think there's definitely a reason why he was so lauded by the USSR and the Bolsheviks, and
Hmm.
precisely because of the lower depths and also his book Mother, which I definitely recommend. Um,
Hmm.
he was the pioneer of what is called kind of proletarian literature,
Hmm.
where, like you said, it's showing that stark, kind of crude, real depiction of the working classes.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I'll definitely check it out. Reading this made me a lot more interested in reading him, I think. And it was interesting because when I was doing a little bit of background reading for our conversation about this, it made me realize how much his name comes up, I think, especially if you live in Russia. I mean, he's kind of omnipresent in a sense. I mean, in Moscow, you got Parkorkova, like he's right there. Oh, which
I'm not
certainly.
sure if you knew this, but Gorky is not his real name. So he was
Yes,
born
he
as
adapted it.
Peshkov, and Gorky means bitter
Hmm.
in Russian. And I think precisely because of his background and the types of themes he wrote about.
Absolutely. Like, although it's interesting because despite the fact that I can imagine, even just from that little bit of information, how bitter of a person he must have been, this work doesn't feel bitter to me. And actually, that was something that surprised me because Dostoevsky is a person who definitely was a very bitter person. And I think that that shows in his work, despite the fact that towards the end of his career, he was trying, I think, to present a more optimistic worldview in a sense. But this play, to me, for as bleak as it is, does feel like it is imbued with a sense of, I don't know, there's just like a lack of cynicism to it, I guess, that surprised me, especially with his inclusion of a character like Luca. Like, I think it would have been so easy to present that in an incredibly cynical way. And yet he doesn't do that. And I have a lot of respect for him for that because I think that was again something that I would have as a criticism of Dostoevsky's. I think his cynicism got in his own creative way sometimes, um, and takes away from the truthfulness, the human truth behind some of the things he was exploring. And I think that's too bad. And I'm glad that somebody who kind of came after him was able to circumvent that somehow. I don't know if that's the impression you got, but I just did not find this incredibly cynical.
No, I'm definitely on the same page as you because there's for many characters that kind of longing for something more than
Yeah.
what they have, despite the bleakness. There's
Yeah.
one,
And I don't even think the things that they want are frivolous or silly. Like, I think if Dostoevsky would have written this, he would have made fun of those people for the things that they wanted. And I think that Gorky had a lot of respect for the dreams of these people.
no doubt. There's a quote.
Hmm.
I think it was Bubnov from Act Three.
Hmm.
He said, "Somewhere on this earth there must be a righteous land, and wonderful people live there. Good people. They respect each other, help each other, and everything is peaceful and good." And so that man who was always searching for this land of righteousness, he was poor and lived miserably. And when things got to be so bad with him that it seemed there was nothing else for him to do but to accept accept to lie down and die, even then he never lost heart. But he'd just smile and say, "Never mind, I can stand it a little while longer, and I'll have done with this life, and I'll go in search of the righteous land." It was his one happiness, the thought of that land. So there's that longing, um, maybe not for like an ideal like utopia or some type of system,
Hmm.
but something better.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, again, I think that to be cynical about that kind of yearning is unfair. And I'm really glad that he gave it space with a bit of dignity to say, like, I mean, listen, if you're living this kind of life, is it really so wrong to have those types of dreams that maybe bleed into a little bit of escapism that means that maybe you're not struggling so hard. But it's like if at the end of the day it doesn't matter how hard you struggle, you're going to end up in the same place, then I'm very sympathetic to the people who just don't want to try. They're just like, I want this thing, I don't think I can get it, but I'll find it in these small moments in my life. I just keep coming back to Natasha and her book, and I'm just like, I can't blame her. I can't. Like it makes perfect sense to me that somebody in her position would want to just have this kind of daydreamy existence of like, oh yes, one day my prince will come and like whatever, like because what difference does it make if she does or doesn't? I felt similarly about Anna actually, and the uh, the push, I think, for her to choose whether or not death was something to dread or if it was going to be a relief in a way. And I thought that Luca's kindness in saying, no, it'll be better, like, you're going somewhere better. Again, I could be very sympathetic to that. And I think that sometimes when people land on the side of, no, you have to live in reality and the truth is the most important thing, I'm like, all the time in all cases, like what would have made the end of her life better by accepting that, the cold embrace of death was just horrible and like it was the end. And if you have no life, you have nothing. I mean, like what was that going to do for her at that point? So
Yeah,
I don't know.
that one quote, which I really love, "Truth is the religion of free
Mm,
men."
hmm.
Um, and I think it, like for me, it's definitely important to have a bit of both.
Yeah.
Like obviously not being delusional, but also having your comforts.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of again where I see it as a somewhat false dichotomy because I agree with you. Like I don't think necessarily having those comforts or in not involving yourself, but giving into that type of escapism is necessarily at odds with living in reality at all times. Like for instance, if I sit down to watch a TV show or read a novel or something, I don't think that that's the same as being like, I don't know what's going on around me. I don't pay attention. I just pretend that I live in this fantasy world. I'm like, no, I think it's kind of a necessary thing in in the hellscape that we sometimes find ourselves in, like I
Yeah,
just don't know that we're designed not to have both of those things.
It actually reminds me of this very interesting story about Lenin, Vladimir
Mm.
Lenin. Um, so he is a big fan of this book, What Is to Be Done by Nikolai Chernyshevsky. Maybe you're familiar with it.
I am,
Um,
yeah. I only because my context for that is that Dostoevsky hated it, but go on.
I actually have a copy right here. But so Lenin kind of was very inspired by this book and kind of took on this role of like the iron-willed revolutionary from this novel.
Mm,
Um, and while he was leading the newly formed Soviet Russia during the Civil War, he kind of took that on. And there was this interesting quote where he said, "I really love Beethoven,
mm,
but I can't listen to Beethoven because I need to have an iron will and I need to
mm,
live and breathe the misery of Russia if I'm going to solve all of its issues."
mm.
So maybe it kind of goes into like that very cranked up version of truth is the religion of free men.
Yeah, I would say so. Although I guess my counter to that would be, I don't know if you're familiar with Emily St. John Mandel, the Canadian author, but she wrote a book called Station 11. And one of the central themes in that book is this quote that I think she claims is originally from Star Trek, but I can neither
Oh,
confirm or deny because I am not a Trekkie.
Station 11.
But like, it's called, what is the quote? It's survival is insufficient. And to me, sometimes that idea of truth being the ultimate goal, sometimes I think can make cynics and nihilists of people in ways that they end up focusing so much on this idea of getting through every day and this like kind of lofty notion of this ultimate reality. But for some reason, it always seems to me that those types of people who go so far down that path are so miserable. And like your pursuit of truth does not seem to be bringing you joy, although it does seem to be making you feel like, but this is real. And I'm like, I don't know. I think sometimes that's where art steps in. Like, I do think that the human spirit, so to speak, definitely has a need for both of those things. And that's why I say like that quote survival is insufficient makes a lot of sense in this context as well. Because I'm like, here are these people in this play who are doing nothing but surviving. And I think that there is a misery in that. And if we look at the people who find those moments of happiness in the escapism that they engage in, again, to me, that almost feels healthier, I suppose, than someone like Kaish who's saying, like, no, none of that, just work all the time. If you're not working, you're not trying hard enough. And I'm like, I don't know if that's really the answer either. I don't know how you feel about that, but that was something that also struck me. It just really reminded me of that in her book.
It reminds me of this Nietzsche quote. Um, to live is to suffer, to survive is
Mm,
to find some meaning in the suffering.
mm-hmm.
So, like you said, having art take its place, and maybe not the antidote, but the intertwining
Salve.
with the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that there's this kind of weird conception that some people have. And I think you see it sometimes, especially in like dystopian things, or even in something like The Matrix, like that the idea that the truth is, yeah, it's like even in this, it's like the uncomfortable truth. And I'm like, what is it about the truth that makes us feel like it always has to be miserable? Like, I've never really seen that idea proposed in any other way. And I think that there is something almost naive in that too, where it's this very black and white concept of like, well, if it's the truth, it must be, yeah, uncomfortable at best or something, and to me, that's just sort of, yeah, it is a little naive. Like, especially considering that throughout our entire existence, I mean, humans have always been creating art. Is that not also a form of truth? I'm pretty sure Oscar Wilde would say that it is, in
Yes,
fact, a reflection of us too.
and truth. I don't want to say truth is objective or subjective, but
Mhm.
there's a role of perspective also.
Certainly.
in
Yeah.
anything.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely. I mean, I know so many people who, and I'm sure you've probably at least come across this argument before as a reader of fiction, but like there are definitely times when I've been told by people who say, like, oh, reading fiction is a waste of time because it's not true. And I think anybody who, especially readers of literature who do that type of literary analysis, would make the argument, well, just because it didn't really happen doesn't mean that it's not true. You know, reading this is feels very true. There are many, novels that I've read that I would say feel like they have the capacity to reflect human truth
yes.
almost better, I think, than nonfiction can sometimes.
I'm not sure if you're a fan of Neil Gaiman by chance, but he
Oh,
has a very
I've
great viewpoint
dabbled.
on this.
Mm,
Um, he has this great lecture called Truth in Fiction,
mm,
and
mm,
using Coraline, his book Coraline as an example, he said that fiction is like a piece of chocolate or a piece of candy.
mm,
The story is the wrapper, and the truth is at the center of
mm,
it. And if there isn't truth at the center of fiction, then it's not going to be digestible for people because that's why we read when say Harry Potter, for example.
mhm,
Kids who watch Harry Potter want to have some escapism and to go and have some power and to go into a
mm,
magical world. Or Coraline, um, people who read Coraline want, or maybe going through something and having that kind of struggle like Coraline does. So there's that
mhm.
real truth added.
Yeah. And I think as well, like art is one of those things where, not to say that stark reality inherently divides people, but I think that art has this inherent property of connection between people. And again, not to say that nonfiction or the truth can't do that, but I think that there's something about wrapping the human experience around this sort of fictional design is in some ways better equipped to foster those types of connections and that type of compassion and empathy because it's just I think our little human brains need stories to be able to understand things better because like I don't know if you've ever read it and I'm so sorry if you have ever had to endure but one of the book clubs that I am in this year we read Why Nations Fail,
I've heard
which
of it.
oh, it's a hateful book. Anyway, but like it's just really dense. Anyway, but like that type of macro level approach to looking at humanity, I think has limitations because even if what you're saying is true, and I mean they won the Nobel Prize in economics, so I'm not going to be that tinfoil hat conspiracist and say no, it was totally garbage what they were talking about. Like, who am I? But like even if what they're talking about conceptually is factually accurate, I think in reading something like that, it's very difficult to engage with it if there's no narrative for you to latch on to. And I think in fiction, in some ways, it's almost safer because I think because we do this all the time on the news, we narrativize stories, right? And we're taking reality and putting it through a very specific lens. And to me, it's so much easier for that to be a slippery slope into unreality than fiction where you're from the ground up you go into that world with the understanding that like okay exactly these people didn't exist and do these things and say these things but conceptually there's something real behind this that I can then filter these loftier concepts through this narrative that
Especially when like Why Nations Fail and you're talking about
yeah
things on such a macro scale.
yeah
It's very difficult to grasp the actual realities of it from a human perspective.
it's
Um,
certainly. And then so I think it makes it harder to understand what you're supposed to do with it. Like when I read something like The Lower Depths, it feels a little bit more like an unspoken call to action than something on that sort of macro level because once you zoom out so far, I think fostering yeah, a feeling that you're supposed to do something with this information becomes a little bit more difficult because even in nonfiction, like if you read a memoir or something, once you zoomed in that close, that call to action feels a little bit more graspable than something on that massive scale. And I think that's why somebody like, if we go back to Russian fiction, I mean, somebody like Tolstoy was so successful, I think, because he was able to kind of thread that needle so well. I mean, you have something like War and Peace, which is on one sense, in one sense, very macro level what he's talking about. But because you can latch onto the struggles and storylines of these individual people, suddenly that macro level scale of what's going on feels sort of more clear, I
You can get
think.
invested a bit more.
Much more so. And I think actually
Sorry.
invested is a very good word too for it. Yeah, because it's not just can I grasp what it is, but yeah, it's like so what? And I think that
Yeah.
that answer to that question of so what is in some ways, at least to me, very biased as a fiction reader, but like I think there's something about fiction writing that gets at that so what aspect to the world so much better in a way. I don't
Yes.
know.
I always say it's the sweet stuff to make the medicine go down, in a sense. That's what
Hmm.
story is.
Definitely.
Um, but speaking more about the lower classes, I had an
Yeah.
interesting topic about conformity.
Mm,
Um, so the lower classes in the lower depths are chained economically and by their
mhm,
class position, but they're seemingly free from conformity in the same way that the upper classes have this rigid sort of lifestyle, especially at
mhm.
that period. Um, the lower classes are frank and honest, and they're not afraid to be villainous in some cases, and they're not chained by morality. Um, did you have the same kind of perspective on conformity and morality in the lower classes?
When I saw that in your notes, I actually thought that was really interesting because that wasn't something that really occurred to me while I was reading it. But when you said that, I was kind of mulling it over, and I think I'm still mulling over how I feel about that exactly because on the one hand, I think that that's just objectively kind of a true statement, right? But on the other hand, I'm like, but there is something in me where I'm like, I don't know, maybe it's my own class consciousness, but I'm like, I don't want to feel sorry for those upper class people that they were confined by their own rules. But I think there is certainly a lot of truth to that. I don't really, I guess I'm still trying to think of what I feel about that. Could you say more about sort of your feeling of about that?
Yeah, I guess not so much that the upper classes are chained by conformity,
Mhm.
but that the lower classes have this unspoken freedom that they don't.
Mm. Mm. And what do you think sort of they're able to do with that freedom, or is it just sort of like an observation? That was the part that I'm still sort of mulling over how I feel about it.
I think what it says to me, especially
Mhm.
in here, is that the lower classes are inherently more honest because of that,
Mm,
and that they're not
hmm
chained by the rules that are set by the upper classes.
mm,
And that's how I kind of see it. Um,
hmm
and because of that, they're able to build something new,
mm.
something that,
Okay, yeah, that's interesting.
yeah, that's how I kind of see it. And
Okay, yeah. Well,
there
I
was,
can tell you that in Why Nations Fail, the authors would agree with you. They would call it creative destruction. God, that book.
right. Uh, yes, it's a very interesting notion, opportunity and chaos and so forth.
Hmm.
And there's one quote that was really good that speaks to this. Yes, Pepel says, "Beast, bragging about your beastliness." And then
Mm.
Vasilisia says, "I'm not bragging, I speak the truth."
Yeah. And it's interesting actually because going back to this question of like stark reality versus the uncomfortable truth versus the comfortable lie or however you want to phrase it, like I do think that that is somewhere where it does kind of come in useful because I do think there is something true in that idea, yeah. Of like being able to not revel in your beastliness but at least call a spade a spade. I would agree with that, that there is a sort of usefulness to being able to call things what they are. And I don't know if that's what you were sort of alluding to, where the upper classes don't have that freedom, but I think in some ways it's a little insidious, right? Because when you're using language to obfuscate what the reality of a situation is, and using that obfuscation to make people who are not at the bottom feel comfortable, you do sort of lose the plot a little bit. So to that extent, I absolutely would agree with that for sure.
Yeah, because it goes also into like just the system more generally. Because I guess one person's oppression is another person's profit in this sense.
Mm,
So for the upper classes, it's just it's just life. This is just reality. And then for the lower classes, yeah, it's reality and it's not good.
yeah, it's reality in a very material sense.
Exactly. Um, yeah. And speaking more about the characters, there's a few of them that have vices such as alcoholism.
Mm,
And for me, I kind of think that the vices were portrayed quite sympathetically.
hmm
For example, the actor's descent into alcoholism and the Baron's fall from grace are not
hmm
mere personal failings, but are symptomatic of the society. And like you
Yes.
said earlier in our discussion, that the society offers little in the ways of redemption or escaping that kind of cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think, I mean, not again to beat a dead horse, but I think that that was a place where Gorky succeeded, where somebody like Dostoevsky failed. I really think that that was a crucial um, aspect of the conversation that people like Gorky were bringing to the table. Yes, 1,000%.
And I was going to ask this earlier, but what do you think the abuse of Nastya kind of meant to the overall message of the play, or what role
Well,
did it
first of
play?
all, I think it goes without saying that that was just horrific to read about. Anyway, but yeah, I think I was mulling that over again when I saw that in your notes as a question to bring up of kind of what is the point of this. And I think that for me, the easiest answer is to say that it's again this kind of pitting against each other of people who otherwise ought to be standing shoulder to shoulder. Um, but as well, I think it's always I find in a lot of Russian literature from this period, it's just so unpleasant to read about the abuse of women in that way. And it's always
Certainly,
so graphic and treated sort of in a la-di-da sort of manner. So I always find it
like
really,
every
really
day.
uncomfortable. Yeah, every day, all the time, expectation. And I think that that moment where oh gosh, what is her name? But one of the women was talking about how the day her husband died, she
Right.
realized that she was kind of free. And to me, the abuse of Natasha, like I said, I think the easy answer is you're pitting together people who otherwise shouldn't be fighting with each other. They should be fighting together. But I think it also just illustrates the the sort of brutality that existed towards women both like at all stratas of society. Like certainly the upper classes were doing this too. I mean, Dostoevsky writes about it all the time. Tolstoy will brush upon it from time to time. But yeah, to me, I just couldn't get past the the brutality of it and how pointless it was, I guess. I don't know. Maybe you have something a little bit less emotional to say about it, but that always hits me very emotionally to read those things.
No, it's definitely unpleasant. But I think also Gorky wants to it is unfortunately a um an accurate picture,
Yeah.
unfortunately. Um, but speaking thematically, I think
Yeah.
what it represents is the abuse of Russia and Russian society at that time, and that hurting women or your common man is you're only hurting yourself in the end because
hmm
there should be this collective. So I think for me that's what it kind of represents, that they're
Yeah.
destroying their own society by having these types of acts and behavior.
Yeah, and I actually wonder, kind of springboarding off of that point that you're making, if that isn't also somewhat the moral of the story, which is, a society is only as healthy as its foundation. And I mean, this is called the lower depths, right? So if you're looking at your society through the lens of how well off are the lowest people in the world that you have kind of created. And in this case, it's very obvious that that foundation is rotten. And so I think it kind of brings into question the sustainability of a society like that. And to your point of her kind of being emblematic of the abuse of that bottom strata. I mean, who really realistically in most societies that have these oppressive aspects to them, who are lower than the poorest women? I mean, I think that the fact that she is a woman and she's the one who takes the brunt of the abuse here is not insignificant either. Especially given that you have, as you said, like the idea of like Mother Russia, you know.
Yeah, in a sense, that's kind of how I saw it. Um,
Mm, I think it's
but that's a
interesting.
really good point that it's about how toxic the lower depths are as a result of this, and the only people who are benefiting from them fighting amongst each other are the upper classes.
Yeah. If you have a society upon which you have this rotten foundation, like, does anybody really succeed? Can anybody really find happiness in a system like that? And I would argue very, very few.
Yeah, I think this also goes back into the um, like the comfortable life. Like I think
Yeah.
definitely the upper classes, especially at that period, um, turned a blind eye or tried to think that it didn't happen, or they also
Mm-hmm.
tried to say that they're like separate from us in some
Mm-hmm.
way, like that's a separate society and we have our society.
Yeah. And I mean, again, not to put too fine a point on it, but living in Canada and seeing the homelessness epidemic, it
Mm,
really, really, that was what I kept coming to my mind reading this is I was like, the way that these people in this play are treated is very, very similar to the way that we treat unhoused people. You know, I find that incredibly abhorrent and very, very related to this because I'm like, if you think about the lower depths of a society like Canada or the United States, I mean, who, if not the homeless, occupy the lower depths of our society? And what does that say about us?
um, there was one quote here that I wanted to also share from Act Two. I think it's like a lyric or maybe some
Mm-hmm.
prose. But it goes, if tomorrow the sun were to forget to light our earth, tomorrow then some madman's thought would bathe the world in sunshine.
Also somewhat prescient. But yeah.
Definitely
Mm.
relevant. Do you think with that, Gorky is alluding to himself for people like him who are delivering these types of stories?
I think so. I think it definitely speaks, as we were discussing, to this idea that you kind of need a maybe not need, but that bottom up approach to telling the truth through fiction is a necessary component for arriving at truth.
But bringing things to a
Yeah.
hopeful conclusion,
Yeah.
how did the ending strike you?
Well, I mean, not again, not to overuse the word poignant, but I think it is very poignant that we end on this note of the actor. And if we look at who survives this play and who doesn't, I think again, to me, it was obviously a little bit melancholy to end on that note, this reminder of how close all of these people were to making a similar choice to, I think, what the actor did, but saying like it is, I don't know, like that being kind of the two outcomes for these people was like either you use the limited freedom that you have to choose death over misery. I found that very, very poignant. I don't know how did you take it? Maybe you can find the levity in it, but that was where I was kind of left with it.
For me, it was both bleak and hopeful, which it was
Mm,
interesting
hmm
because they end on that note of drink and song.
hmm
Um,
That's true.
so they were all very close to having this awakening, but then they kind of
Hmm
relapse in a way, and they kind of
hmm
are staying with their old tricks. So it kind
hmm
of shows that there is hope, but
hmm
that type of lifestyle, it's so easy just to remain as you are and in
hmm
those cycles.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was a very interesting ending. In reading about this play and people's reactions to it, I know people have very mixed opinions on the ending to the play. I liked it. It sounds like you liked it as well. I understand why people found it abrupt or thematically strange, but I didn't find that it was inconsistent with what he was talking about. So I thought it was very appropriate personally.
Yeah, and I think all the themes kind of are still like reinforced right at the
Hmm
end.
hmm
Like with that quote, in the carriages of the past, you can't go anywhere.
hmm
And then they get right back into that carriage in a way,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah. But maybe next time. I guess that's kind of where the hope in the ending lies, is that
There's a
there
chance.
was this feeling of like this could have gone a very different way, and maybe next time it will. And I saw in your notes as well about the for this discussion of this predictive aspect of the Russian Revolution that Gorky was sort of riding the wave of, and like I think you can see it in that almost kind of, if we think of it as like water, it's like they almost reached the top of the dam and spilled over, and the implicit threat to all of the people on the other side in the upper classes of how close they're getting to breaking that dam and getting to the other side. So in that sense, I did find it very predictive, and he definitely had his finger on the pulse of what was going on for sure.
Yes, it's quite amazing because not only was he prophetic about 1917, but
Mm,
also 1905, which was
mm,
the
mhm.
first Russian Revolution,
Very
which they called
close.
the dress rehearsal,
Mm,
but the real revolution. Um, yeah, 1902 with this was very significant. So everything was right under the surface
hmm And you definitely get that. It's like, oh, they went back to their song and dance this time.
this time. They'll have a nap and then they'll be refreshed and say, okay, today's the day.
Today's the day.
Yes,
Yeah, I mean, it's as I say, it's what gives me the hope that history being cyclical in a sense doesn't always have to be um, a bleak sentiment. I think sometimes that cyclical nature of how humans react to their own oppression, but we do have a lot of evidence to suggest that it's like maybe this time, but and then there's the sort of dot dot dot, and I think that's what kind of keeps us getting out of bed in the morning is that dot dot dot. So
right. That kind of mission,
mm, whatever it looks like for you.
right? So I think on that, Ren, we covered a lot
Hmm.
of topics. I think we had
Oh
some
yeah.
great thematic discussion.
Yeah,
Thank you for joining.
I can only say that I'm really grateful that you kind of brought this to my attention because
Mhm.
it really not only showed me some gaps in my Russian literary knowledge, especially more contemporary things. I mean, 100 years ago, but relatively contemporary. And also, I just really enjoyed it so much. And I know you said you've read it 4 times. I've read it once, but I can definitely see myself catching up to your 4 times of having read it because I think it's just a very rich text. And I think I have less of a chance of getting to go see it in Canada than you do in Russia. But if I ever am back in Russia and I get the chance, I would love to see this performed. I think it would be very, it would just be a fabulous experience.
Certainly, it's definitely on my list to hunt for. There's so many theaters here in
Mm,
Moscow, so I'm sure there's at least one that has it. So thank you for joining, Ren. I'm glad we were able to have this
thank
discussion
you.
about the Lower Depths by Maxim Gorky.
Yes, absolutely. Bringing something from the lower depths to the surface, perhaps.
Yes, Many good lower depths puns in this discussion.
You can't get out from under that.
Agreed.